Section 63. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, by Charles LEA, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Breck. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3, by Charles LEA, Book 8, Chapter 4, Part 7. Spheres of Action. Censorship. Towards the close of the 18th century, Llorente tells us that licenses were difficult to obtain. When an application was made, the Inquisitor General instituted secret inquiries as to the character of the applicant, and if the result was favorable, he was required to state his object and the nature of the works that he desired to consult. If the license was granted, it was limited to a specific number of books in a definite branch of literature. Permission to keep them was rarely granted, and all licenses accepted works directed against Catholicism, such as the writings of modern philosophers. Doubtless this strictness may be true of certain times, but the practice varied according to the temper of the Inquisitor General or Suprema. There sometimes was great laxity, if we may believe the reasons alleged in 1747 by Prado y Suesta for revoking all licenses, for he says that on investigation he had found that they were not sought by men of learning, but by frivolous of both sexes to gratify idle curiosity. Many persons merely made a verbal request to read a single book and extended the permission to cover all that they wanted, while others, seeing that ignorant people were licensed, thought that the privilege was general and availed themselves of it without asking. Licenses, moreover, were by no means so restricted in character as Llorente asserts. Some issued by Inquisitor General Bonifaz and Beltran cover all prohibited books, except Machiavelli, Sarpi, Council of Trent, works assailing the Catholic religion and obscenities. And we have seen that religious houses generally and even occasionally individuals held licenses enabling them to purchase from estates considering miscellaneous lots of prohibited books, the possession of which by deceased scholars show that they too must have enjoyed similar privileges. From the very numerous applications for licenses made about this time, it appears that they were customarily addressed to the Suprema, which referred them to the appropriate tribunal for report as to the age, the learning and the judgment of the applicant. Under the Restoration, this inquiry was extended to his moral and political conduct, showing that discrimination was made in favor of those whose conservative tendencies were approved. We have seen the ferocious penalties of death and confiscation provided in the law of 1558 for unauthorized printing. With these the Inquisition had nothing to do, as its censorship was concerned only with books after publication, and its treatment of those who violated its rules was much more moderate. With its jurisdiction over them it allowed no interference, even from Rome, for, about 1565, it suppressed a papal jubilee indulgence because it contained faculties of absolution for keeping prohibited books. In the Index of 1559, the penalties threatened for reading, possessing, buying or selling prohibited books were excommunication, late sentencing, lache sententiae ipso facto, 200 ducats, and a menace of the prosecution for suspicion of heresy and disobedience. In the special edicts prohibiting individual books, there appears to be no established formula. Sometimes the penalty threatened is excommunication and 200 ducats, sometimes excommunication and punishment at discretion, sometimes excommunication, fine, and punishment at discretion. This discretion manifested itself in a great variety of penalties, moderate and severe, both as regards readers and booksellers, though the latter appear commonly to be more harshly visited. A rehabilitation granted, September 28, 1647, to Luis Sanaran, bookseller of Saragossa, infers that he had been reconciled and deprived of his civil rights. Miguel Rodriguez, a bookseller of Madrid, for importing and selling prohibited books, was sentenced, August 1, 1763, to reprimand, absolution ad cautelam, certain spiritual penances, all costs of the trial, and banishment from Madrid for 6 years, of which the first 3 were to be spent in an African presidio. This of course meant his utter ruin. At Lograno, In 1645, Fray Tomás de Nieva, for teaching in his professorial chair from a prohibited book, was condemned to grave reprimand before his colleagues, to retract certain propositions, to 4 years' reclusion, and to perpetual deprivation of teaching and of voting and being voted for. On the other hand, in 1803, Don Jacobo Maria de Parga y Puga, for the inveterate habit of reading prohibited books knowing them to be prohibited, in contempt for many years of the authority of the Inquisition, was sentenced by the Madrid tribunal to 15 days' spiritual exercises and to private reprimand in the apartments of the inquisitor. So, in 1816, the Suprema, acting on a sumaria and without subjecting the delinquents to a trial, sent to the Santiago tribunal a sentence on Juan Romero for reading prohibited books and on Josef Manuel Garcia for selling and recommending them, for they were to present themselves before the nearest commissioner, who was to reprimand and warn them for a repetition of the offence they would not be treated with the same benignity. Cases of infraction until a comparative recent period are not frequent. After the excitement of the Reformation was suppressed, intellectual activity in Spain seems to have been reduced to such torpor that the forbidden fruit was little sought. In Toledo record from 1575 to 1610, there is not a single case, nor is there one in the same record from 1648 to 1794. In the disturbance of thought preceding and during the revolutionary epoch, prosecutions became more frequent, although still not as numerous as might be expected from the importance claimed by the Inquisition for its services. From 1780 until 1820, in the whole of Spain, the total aggregate amounts only to 305. During this period, from 1808 to 1815 inclusive, the Inquisition was virtually dormant, having only 5 cases in all, which would leave for the remaining years an average slightly under 9. The crowding of 101 cases in the 6 years, 1801 to 1806, reflect the urgency with which the government of Carlos IV was endeavoring to restrict the press, and there were 20 in 1819, insignificant of the agitation leading to the revolution of January 1820. The slenderness of the whole record is the measure of the success which attended the combined action of the State and of the Inquisition in benumbing for nearly 3 centuries the Spanish intellect. Although censorship was instituted for the suppression of heresy and for keeping heretical books and propositions from the people, it developed its utility in many directions, more or less connected with its primary object. It was inevitable that it should wage incessant warfare with the countless editions of the Bible with Protestant notes and commentaries, and we have seen how industriously Valdez prepared for his expurgatory index of the Scriptures in 1554. It was, however, the vernacular versions that caused the greatest anxiety. Prior to the Reformation, there was practically no restriction on the circulation of the Bible in the vulgar tongue. It is true that in the early 13th century the struggle with the Waldenses and the Cathari, who possessed versions of their own, led to prohibitions by Innocent III in 1199, and by Jaime I of Aragon in 1234, while the Council of Toulouse in 1229 prohibited the possession by laymen of any portion of the Bible, even in Latin, as well as the Breviary and the Hours of the Virgin in the vernacular, because they contained extracts. The decree of Pope Innocent became embodied in the Corpus Juris and thus remained familiar to canon lawyers. It was adduced in the Repertorium Inquisitorum of 1494, but only in a kind of obiter dictum, showing that at the time it was regarded as of no practical moment. Yet from the 13th to the 16th century there was no prescription of vernacular Bibles. The temporary causes which had led to the prohibition had passed away, and many translations were made, especially in Germany. One in Catalan by Bonifacio Ferrer, brother of San Vincent Ferrer, was printed in Valencia in 1478 under the editorship of the Inquisitor Jaime Burrell. It was natural that the use made of the Bible by the reformers should cause the revival of these obsolete prohibitions. Even before the compilation of the indexes, we find Inquisitor General Tavera granting to the Duchess of Soma, wife of the Admiral of Naples, a license to keep and read a Bible in Italian. but the permission is limited to 1 year, showing how carefully it was guarded. It was therefore a matter of course that the Index of 1551 should contain a prohibition of the Bible in Spanish or any vulgar tongue. This zeal was intensified by the versions which the Spanish refugees Francisco de Enzinas, Juan Perez, Cipriano de Valera and Casiodoro de Reina perfected and strove to introduce into Spain. But the prohibition was not confined to these; it extended to all fragments and extracts, however orthodox the rendering, as though to keep the unlearned ignorant of the existence of the Bible, or at least to make them understand that it was a wholly forbidden book. The Index of 1559 condemns 22 editions of the Hours of the Virgin in Romance, together with all others containing similar superstitions, but the real objection was the passage of Scripture contained in them, and, in 1573, all hours in Romance were forbidden, as the Council of Toulouse had done in 1229. The extreme care with which the public was guarded from the Bible is seen in 1583 Index of Quiroga, which, in forbidding all portions of Scripture in Romance, only accepts the fragments embodied in the canon of Mass, and the texts which Catholic writers may cite and explain, provided they are not printed alone but are in sermons and other works of edification. So unreasoning was this jealousy that, according to Espisueta, there were earnest men who desired to suppress vernacular versions of the Creed, the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria and the Salve Regina, a zeal which found practical expression in 1674, when the Inquisition prohibited a work entitled Exercicios de Devotion because it contained translations of the Miserere, the Magnificat, the Te Deum and the Athanasian symbol. The people were to be kept in such profound ignorance that the Sotomayor Index of 1640 prohibits not only the vernacular Bible and all its parts, but even summaries and compendiums of it, and as though to render it hateful, in the Edicts of Faith it was classed with the Koran and other Mahometan books, the possession of which was to be denounced to the Inquisition. It had to watch not only over its Spanish flock but over its converts in the Indies, when it found that the English Society of Propagation of the Gospel had caused versions to be made in Indian tongues and was circulating them in America. The unexpected missionary work called for fresh exertion, and in 1710 we find Clement XI congratulating Inquisitor General Ebafiez on his efforts and urging him to persistent watchfulness. This treatment of the Bible seems to have piqued the curiosity of the intelligent, for in 1747 Inquisitor General Prado y Cuesta complains of the inordinate desire of many persons to have it in the vernacular, but among the mass of the people it produced the impression desired. In 1791 Villanueva tells us that they who once sought it now regard it with horror and detestation. Many care nothing for it and more are ignorant of its very existence. Yet within a decade of Prado's utterance the policy of the Church changed. Although in 1713 Clement XI, in the bull Unigentius, had condemned the use of the Bible by the laity as a Jansenist error, yet only 44 years later the Congregation of the Index in 1757 conceded the use of vernacular versions, if approved by the Holy See and accompanied with orthodox comments. This was followed in 1771 by a version of the Acts of the Apostles by Catenacci, dedicated to Clement XIV, and in 1778 by the brief In Tanta Liborum, in which Pius VI approved of a translation of the whole Bible by Archbishop Martini. The Spanish Inquisition promptly followed the papal example. In 1782 Inquisitor General Beltran issued a decree reciting that ample cause had existed for exceeding the Tridentine rule, but these causes had ceased, and in view of the usefulness of the sacred text, the Spanish rule was modified to conform to that of Trent, to the decree of the Congregation of 1757, and to the brief of 1778. In 1783 the Suprema ordered that the French version of the Le Maître de Saki would be freely allowed, and in 1790 there appeared in Valencia a complete Spanish translation by Cio de San Miguel, which was speedily and repeatedly reprinted. No such evils have followed as were dreaded for 2 centuries, showing how much wiser would have been the policy of meeting the heretic scriptures with an orthodox version, fortified with appropriate comments. The same jealousy of admitting the vulgar to too great a familiarity with spiritual things showed itself with regard to works of devotion and edification. In 1570, a consulta of the Suprema to the Inquisitor General recommended that the catechism should not be printed in Romance. In the preface to the Index of 1583, the prohibition of works by men of the highest Christian repute, such as Fisher of Rochester, Thomas More, Geronimo Osorio, Francisco de Borja, Luis de Granada, Juan de Avila, and others, is explained, partly by books having been falsely attributed to them, partly by occasional incautious passages, and partly by their not being fitted for circulation in the vulgar tongue. The case of Obras de Cristiano of St. Francisco de Borja is illustrative. In the Index of 1559 it is simply prohibited. After his death in 1572 as General of the Society of Jesus, Quiroga in the Index of 1583 added, only in Romance or other vulgar tongue. He was beatified in 1624, but the canonization proceedings were delayed in consequence of his book being in the Spanish Index, and in 1662 the Jesuit Procurator General applied to the Inquisition to rubricate the leaves of a copy and send it to the Congregation of Rites, so as to remove the impediment, but it was not until 1671 that he was finally enrolled in the Catalogue of Saints. The effort to suppress mysticism manifested itself, about 1620, in numerous edicts to suppress books of mystic devotion and lives of men and women who evidently were mystics. Books of ritual were scrutinized with the same captiousness. June 15, 1568, the pontificals printed in Duefias and Valladolid were ordered to be seized. In 1583, some pernicious errors were discovered in the breviary printed in Salamanca in 1575. Even books so elementary as cartillas or primers could not escape. A carta acordada of November 6, 1577, alludes to a previous one of June 14th, ordering the suppression of cartillas containing an article entitled Castigo y Doctrina de Caton. Since then, it goes on to say, there have been found in other cartillas various matters pernicious and contrary to the teachings of the Church, especially in those printed by Juan de la Plaza in Toledo. Wherefore all cartillas of every kind are to be seized in the shops and in the hands of children going to school, and orders are consequently given that no one, under pains and censures, shall hold, read, or sell them. There was little indeed to which the Inquisition could not extend the jurisdiction of its censorship. The Fifth Council of Lateran had alluded to the danger of the public peace arising from libelous attacks on individuals as one of the reasons for the examination and licensing of books before printing. But this was a purely secular matter, and the faculties conferred on the Inquisitor General looked solely to the suppression of heresy. Clement VIII, however, in his Index of 1596, included as subjects of condemnation defamatory memorials against religion or princes, and this opened the way to much else. It is true that an experienced writer assures us that, although such writing can be suppressed by edict, it cannot be under pain of excommunication, but only as a command under pain of mortal sin, and that the Inquisition cannot proceed against the author unless the faith is involved. These limitations, however, were easily overpassed. We have seen how Inquisitor General Pacheco in 1623 condemned some legal documents in defence of the Chancellery of Granada, and commenced prosecutions of the council who had drawn them up. His successor Zapata in 1627 was a trifle more cautious in a conflict wherein the Inquisition was not concerned. The universities of Salamanca, Valladolid, and Alcala united in an attack on the Jesuits and their new college. When the Inquisition ordered the paper suppressed on the ground that it was anonymous and harsh in style, then Salamanca came forward and acknowledged the authorship. The Jesuit procurator still asked for its suppression, but the Inquisition decided that it was not the calidad de oficio and withdrew the prohibition, but still assumed authority to require the removal of asperities. Philip IV was dissatisfied, as he favored the Jesuits, and asked in what this case differed from others in which Pacheco had suppressed similar papers. Section 64.